Like museums, libraries have been undergoing a deep transformation over the course, particularly of the last decade. And that transformation is driven by a number of related convergent factors. One of them is the absolutely transformative fact that vast libraries, libraries that vastly, so, sort of so exceed the scale of traditional analog physical libraries have been coming into being, like, of course, Google Books most famously, but Europeana, like the Digital Public Library of America, which is in construction, like the Hathi Trust Library. Those are all tremendous digital repositories that have millions of objects that are contained within, and those objects can be used and accessed in ways that are new, are different with respect to the modes of access and discovery of the traditional library. So libraries have faced the challenge of trying to think about what is a physical library in a world where on my smartphone I have access to a library that is exponentially greater than the Library of Alexandria or Pergamon was back in antiquity. Maybe a library that's even bigger than the Library of Congress. So what is a physical library in a context where I can have access to such a vast library on my laptop or on my smartphone? That's one factor. The second factor is that the kind of media shifts that have been happening with the increasing ubiquity of digital media forms, with the increasing availability of even traditional library resources in online forms, have created new reading practices, new habits of mind, you might say. And libraries have really had to rethink what is a library experience? Why do you go to a library in a world where information is so superabundant? What does a reading room look like in the digital age? These are fundamental questions that involve the rethinking of and the redesign of the physical library as well. And the third question, the third challenge that I think has been animating the whole issue of the library beyond the book is, of course, that books haven't gone away. We're printing today more books than we have ever printed before in the history of civilization. So on the one hand, we have the migration of knowledge forms to digital media. And at the same time, we have the continuation of the history of print as a medium that is centrally involved in the communication of knowledge. So what does a world look like where we have this coexistence, this constant crisscrossing? And it's constant, and it is crisscrossing, because many of those forms that appear in a kind of digital guise, maybe initially, maybe secondarily, also appear in print. We also have a new problem. It's actually not a totally new problem, but it's an increasingly acute problem of the redundancy between digital and analog. It's a redundancy that I think has posed a really interesting set of questions for the publishing industry too. Sometimes I like to read in analog form. Sometimes I like to read on my device. Which kind of device? How do I design forms of communication around this fluid universe where documents can shift from one to the other, and where we have not only redundancies, but we have versions, sometimes different versions. In short, what this set of challenges creates is an open question about what a library is as a sort of physical institution. And in The Library Beyond the Book, which is itself a book that my colleague Matthew Battles and I just completed this at the end of last year and is forthcoming with Harvard University Press, what we try to explore is a series of scenarios for what the future of libraries might look like. And we start with some of the traditional scenarios of what libraries have been, which is to say, particularly places of dialogue between the living and the dead, mausolea, you might say, where the past is preserved so that the future can have a continuing conversation with the past. But we move from these different scenarios, traditional scenarios, to focus very centrally on the database. So what is a library that's a database? And how do we design databases in ways that have some of the strengths of the traditional library, but also strengths that are distinctive to electronic media, to electronic data, to electronic documents. How do we go beyond, in other words, looking backwards towards a concept of the document that's based on that deep history, that long history of the library that goes back to the remotest sort of portions of the historical record, and begin to think forward about what can we do? What are the unique aspects of engaging with information in digital forms? And one of the areas that we particularly argue for and are interested in is this notion of tapping into the community of readers. Libraries have always been beehives. They've always been places animated by people, not by documents. We think of them as storage houses for documents, but in fact, it's the animation functions that have really defined them as physical spaces as much as their storage features. And the database is the same thing, but it's a different kind of community. The community that reads Google Books or that works with Europeana is a community that is extraordinarily heterogeneous. It's distributed all over the world. The documents are being accessed from all time zones at the same time. And if we could design database-type libraries to tap into the tremendous power of those communities, we're looking at maybe a different kind of vision of what a library is. We're certainly looking at a different vision of what a database is than has been the vision to this day, where we can see the activities of the beehive as we participate in those activities in ways that leverage some of the power of digital data to tell stories that are much bigger than whether person X came into the library and checked in with their card at the gate or not, the more traditional models of how we see the work that goes on. So the redesign of the database as a user-centered environment, as an environment where the community of users is a feature of your experience of documents, is one of the affordances that we are particularly interested in. A second aspect is of the argument of the book that is pertinent to this issue of database libraries, has to do with how do we insert databases into physical space? Because databases fail on one major test that has been a defining feature of the library over the course of its very, very long history, and that is that libraries have been places. And knowledge typically has thrived in places, in physical in contact with physically assembled communities. And no matter how powerful those virtual communities are, we still are social beings, social creatures. We think and live and experience in physical space. So how do we build bridges between this data-rich world of the database library and the physical environments where knowledge is produced? And so within the argument of the book, we try to think speculatively about what libraries could look like, where the database is in a sense inside the architecture, as well as available from offsite. And this interests us in particular, this interests me in particular, as a challenge of, in a sense, answering the question of why does somebody in the digital age go to a physical library? Amazingly enough, the statistics of library use have been increasing over the course of the last 20 years, not decreasing. So the fact that I can have access to a library 10 times bigger than the National Library of country X or country Y on my smartphone has not kept people from wanting to go to this physical space we call a library. But why? What is it that we want libraries to facilitate, to make possible, to do in a world where we have such an overabundance of data? How do we make that data matter in a physical environment? Those are the kinds of questions. And I think the answers are answers that have to do with reimagining the physical space of libraries, reimagining how they function from a policy standpoint, reimagining the devices that they allow for use, lend, reimagining the furnishings, rethinking really all of those aspects that create a certain kind of physical experience, a certain experience of how knowledge lives in space. In short, I think of the library, the redesign of libraries, as really a kind of a crystallization of what I see as the fundamental design challenges of our time in all fields. Namely, how do we weave together in meaningful and significant ways information and space? Libraries have always been heterogeneous institutions. And I think what's important, in fact, the argument that the book, The Library Beyond the Book, makes, is really that we need really a diversity of answers to the question of what is a library. Whereas we used to speak of the library as if there were a single library type. The reality of the library today, the reality of the library in a world where information is so abundant and where many library forms have quite properly and powerfully migrated into the World Wide Web, is a new multiple reality. It's a multiple scenario that's required. We need libraries that are focused on research, and those may not look at all like the little local public library that services a community of people who don't have access to rich resources or who are located in a rural environment. There's a need for libraries that are temporary libraries, that are pop-up libraries, that don't perform what was once the traditional function of a library, which is to preserve, to store, to guarantee continuity. And we need all kinds of hybridities between these different types of libraries. So in my view, the answer to the question is really, in a sense, a kind of transformation of the concept of the library into libraries, a plurality of types that no longer look to that sort of single model as an answer to the question of what a library is. Within this sort of world of libraries instead of the library, I think we have to increasingly understand that it's essential to the health of the overall knowledge system that there be a plurality of parties who play a key role in ensuring access to knowledge. And that includes the possibility that a whole series of different public but also private entities can become involved in the world of libraries, this proliferation of kinds of forms, but also different sectors of society can create their own structures, autonomous structures, structures that don't rely upon central state or governmentally sponsored attempts to construct such resources. And I think one of the powerful potentially transformative at least, aspects of the creation of these great digital repositories is, of course, that they really break a certain kind of filtering central sort of role that has been played, of course, historically by libraries, and create a world where it may be possible to think also of models of what a library is, models of collecting, models of access that step outside the confines of the interests of a nation state or a region or authorities, and that increasingly anchor libraries in local and community values, interests, and needs, including economic needs.